Hello, everyone, and welcome to At Barrons. I'm Andy Serwer, and welcome to our guest, Jodie Ginsberg, President of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Jodie, nice to see you.
And you. Thank you for having me.
So, conditions for journalists around the world seem to be continuing to deteriorate. Why is that, Jodie?
There are a number of reasons, but primarily I think it's to do with the decline in democratic norms that we've seen globally. We've seen the advance of democracy slow in many places, and in some cases actually reverse. And that puts journalists at risk. Journalists are the first draft of history, we like to say. They are the ones reporting on what governments are doing. They are the ones exposing wrongdoing, investigating corruption, and that puts them on the front lines. That puts them in a targeted position. And I think that explains in large part why we have seen this increase in attacks on journalists. Last year we saw a record number of journalists in jail, 363 journalists in jail. That's the highest number ever that CPJ has recorded in the 30 years that we've been documenting jail journalists. And we saw 67 journalists and media workers killed.
Does the rise of nationalism and the decline of globalism have anything to do with this as well?
Yes, I think so. I think what we've seen with the rise of nationalism is increasingly febrile environments, increasing numbers of protests. Protests are places where journalists are found reporting. They are vulnerable on those front lines. So I think that has something to do with it. Nationalistic movements also tend to be quite aggressive in their behaviours online as well as off. So journalists tend to be targeted in the online space. We've seen a huge increase in the numbers of threats that journalists get through social media, for example, particularly women journalists. And that often tends to be associated with the rise of those kinds of nationalist movements.
You're wearing a Free Evan button. Of course, that refers to our Dow Jones colleague, Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who is being held prisoner in Russia. What is the situation with that?
Evan was arrested, as you know, and charged with espionage. He's the first American journalist to have been accused and arrested for espionage since the Cold War, since 1986. So that, I think, tells you everything you need to know about how serious this case is and what a kind of escalation this is. Evan is in pretrial detention, awaiting his first hearing in May, and he's been accused of being a spy. He is nothing but a journalist. He is a journalist. He was in Russia doing journalistic work for the Wall Street Journal, and his case really is emblematic of the kinds of charges we see being leveled against journalists across the world. It's highly unusual that an American journalist and an international journalist has been arrested by Russia in this way, but we know that independent Russian journalism has effectively been all but wiped out in Russia over many years, but that process accelerated since 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, after which they outlawed even talking about the war. Reporting the war as a war could land you with 15 years in jail. So many Russian journalists have fled, are trying to operate in exile. So that's the sort of environment in which Evan is being held, and it's extremely concerning.
Yeah, there's been a number of stories about the state of Russian journalism by Masha Gessen and others as well. What is CPJ doing specifically about Evan in his case?
Well, in the case of Evan, we're trying to raise awareness. We did a number of things very quickly. We arranged for a letter to be written to the Russian ambassador in the US, essentially protesting the arrest, reminding the ambassador that Evan was engaged in legitimate journalism. More than 30 editors from around the world signed that letter, which I think shows you how important this is, not just to the Wall Street Journal, not just to Dow Jones, but to a free press globally. And journalists don't necessarily always show solidarity with one another. And the fact that we had these editors from the likes of the Times of London, the New York Times, the Washington Post, all signing that letter, journalists and editors from Latin America, from Europe, I think shows you just how seriously people take that case. So We arranged that letter to show solidarity, and what we've been trying to do is keep the case in the public eye. It's really important that we don't forget about Evan, that the Russian government know that we are concerned, that we as a people are concerned, but also that the US government, which has now taken on this case because Evan is considered wrongfully detained, which means he is considered essentially a political hostage of the Russian government. We want the US government to know that we expect them to take this extremely seriously and be doing everything they can to get Evan out as soon as possible.
Two-part follow-up question. What can ordinary people do when it comes to helping Evan? And what can companies do, Jodie, in the news business? You talked about it a little bit, but maybe even beyond the news business.
Well, the first thing that we can do is let Evan know that we're thinking about him. I've been working with victims of oppressive governments for many years, and often they find themselves in detention for a very long time. And people think, well, what does it matter if I write a letter? What does it matter if I wear a badge, a T-shirt? That information gets to people. Not every day, but eventually that knowledge gets to the imprisoned person, the imprisoned journalist, and it means a huge amount to know that people back home and across the world are thinking of you. So the Wall Street Journal, for example, has a page specially set up where you can see Evan's journalism, you can see information about Evan and what's going on. All of the paywall has been taken down, and you can send him a letter. So that's the first thing ordinary people can do. I think in terms of what companies can do is to continue to support the work of a free and independent press. The only way I think that we can continue to really challenge these kinds of restrictions on a free press is to continue to support it. It's really important. For many years, I think too many of us have taken for granted journalism. For the whole of the 90s, we were effectively giving away journalism for free on the internet. And I think people lost a sense of why it had value and why it was important. It matters. It matters for all of us, including companies and corporations. A free press is essential for business to operate successfully. It's essential for all of us, you and I, to live free and independent lives. And so I think continuing to invest and support in a free and independent media is a key action that companies can take.
You began your career as a business journalist, and a lot of times people think that business journalists are out of harm's way, but that's not necessarily the case, right? I mean, any journalist can be vulnerable. Business journalists face risks too, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and increasingly in this current environment, journalists everywhere face risks. I tell this story quite often, but when I became a journalist, the only people who we ever thought would be seriously at risk were those becoming war correspondents, those going to cover conflicts. And that's just not the case anymore. I have colleagues who cover politics, for example, who get death threats on a daily basis and now treat that as if that was a normal thing. Well, that wasn't normal 20 years ago, and it shouldn't be thought of as normal that journalists doing legitimate work should be receiving death threats for doing that. Business journalists often are victims of such threats, particularly when they're trying to investigate things like corruption. A number of the journalists that we've supported over the years who've been victims of death threats and so on have been those trying to investigate links between business and government, for example. So it's absolutely not the case that just because you are a business journalist and maybe doing some of your work from behind a desk, that you are not at risk and you're not vulnerable.
How are things like deepfakes and misinformation, fake news, is that tied somehow to risks to journalists?
Yes, it is. And it's tied in a number of ways, and a number of them are fairly insidious. In part, the result of recent years of this flood of mis and disinformation has been to leave people not really knowing where to find truth and not being able to differentiate between mis and disinformation and factual and accurate information. And that's made journalists vulnerable because it allows bad actors, essentially, to accuse journalists of being purveyors of fake news themselves. And that's problematic because once you are considered an enemy of the people. Once you're considered a purveyor of fake news, you're also considered fair game. So we tend to see a sort of trajectory that goes from this mis and disinformation, the smearing of journalists, and then the smearing of journalists becoming much more personalized attacks, particularly online. And then what's really worrying is frequently those online attacks become offline, real-world physical attacks. So that's the kind of trajectory in which deepfake, a sort of challenging of basic facts, ultimately results in journalists becoming vulnerable.
Right, and with the AI, that takes it to a whole nother level, potentially.
Potentially, but what's interesting to me about AI and so on, and people are particularly worried about that at the moment, is, to me, in many ways, it reasserts the importance of journalism, the importance of fact-checking, the importance of being able to show where you got your information, how you got your information, to being able to prove that you know something. And that, to me, seems the very basis of journalism. So in many ways, I think this is a moment for us to reclaim and redemonstrate the value of journalism.
Speaking of expanding journalism, though, with the new newsletters, so many personal blogs, sort of blurring the lines between what's journalism, who's a journalist, who isn't a journalist, does that sort of also make protecting journalists more complicated, or how does that inform your thinking just generally?
Well, protecting journalists is always complicated for many reasons, and increasingly in the world in which we live, the line between journalist and activist in many places is blurred. Many people go into journalism perhaps wanting to expose a particular injustice, but they use the tools and the techniques of the journalist to do so. And so being able to unpick that and show people essentially the workings, be able to show people how somebody arrived at a particular conclusion, how they sourced it, what the evidence was, the tools of journalism, and explaining that back to people, I think is part of the work that we at CPJ and others are also engaged in. So it's not just about protecting the journalist and making sure the journalist is safe, but it's also about explaining why their work has value and impact.
Right. You have a list that you put out about which countries are particularly dangerous for journalists. Which ones are those?
It's an interesting question. So last year, the most dangerous place to be a journalist in terms of killings was Ukraine, obviously. It's a war zone. Many people were killed right at the beginning of the war when I think it wasn't really clear where the front lines were. People were rushing into and learning about how this war was going to be conducted. But interestingly, after Ukraine, the second most dangerous place was Mexico. 13 journalists and media workers were killed there last year. We're still trying to confirm if all of that was related to their work, but it's an incredibly dangerous place to be a journalist, in part because of the nature of the kind of work, which is often looking at the relationship between local authorities and cartels, but also because it's a dangerous environment generally in which to live. And in fact, Latin America in particular is a particularly dangerous region for journalists to operate. Haiti also is a country about which we're particularly worried. So those kinds of countries are dangerous. Iran, obviously, is a place where it's extremely difficult now to operate as a journalist. It's the country which has the highest number of journalists in prison. So that's a difficult place to operate. But what's interesting, I think, about the lists of killed journalists, for example, is that that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are many, many ways to silence reporters, and they don't necessarily all involve physical threat. And what authoritarian regimes in particular have got very good at is using the law to go after journalists. So what we're seeing much more now is a wide variety of attempts to silence journalists using a plethora of laws. Rather than just going after you for your content, they might go after you and accuse you of tax evasion or money laundering or being a threat to national security, to go back to Evan's case. So that's a change that we've seen over the past decade, is this increased use of law, or lawfare, as many people call it, to go after journalists.
And those are countries such as?
Well, countries such as Hong Kong, for example, where we've seen the Apple Daily founder, for example, Jimmy Lai, is currently in jail. Countries like Guatemala, where an editor called Jose Ruben Zamora is currently in pretrial detention accused of money laundering. There's a number of countries that are using these sorts of methodologies to try, Philippines, for example, to try to silence journalists.
What about the risks in the United States, Jodie?
The risks in the United States are growing, I would say, and in part that's a result, I think, of political polarization, language that has demonized journalists over many years. We had the previous president of the United States of America call journalists enemies of the people, which creates these vulnerabilities in which journalists are considered fair game. So now we know that journalists covering political rallies, for example, might be physically threatened. We've had instances where the police have arrested journalists trying to cover protests, famously including live on air. It's an increasingly difficult environment for journalists to operate safely. And on top of that, I think America has something that pretty much no other country has, which is the prevalence of guns. So a place that has 46% of the world's civilian guns is potentially a very dangerous environment for journalists to operate if you don't know how to keep yourself safe in a particular environment. And that's what I think makes this a particularly, potentially America, a unique challenge for journalists, and particularly local journalists who don't necessarily have access to the same kinds of protections as someone who might be working for a big news outlet.
And final question, Jodie, this is very sobering. Is there any reason to be optimistic?
I think so. I wouldn't do this job if I wasn't an optimist. I think there's every reason to be optimistic. I'm optimistic for a number of reasons. I'm optimistic because I'm seeing new forms of funding coming into the sector. We're seeing the flourishing of local journalism, community journalism, different types of journalism. We're seeing much more diversity coming into the newsroom, many more people telling many more stories that never got told before. And that's really important. So I'm optimistic for that. I'm optimistic that people still want to do this profession. There continue to be hundreds of young journalists going into the profession globally and still wanting to do this work. I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic, not least because the work that we do is really important.
Jodie Ginsberg, President of the Committee to Protect Journalists, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You've been watching at Barrons. I'm Andy Serwer. We'll see you next time.